The moment that changes everything rarely announces itself in advance. Mine arrived on a crisp November afternoon, surrounded by the scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon, when my mother-in-law Barbara leaned across my carefully arranged Thanksgiving table and said, "We've always known you trapped our son, Sarah. 12 years of marriage, a beautiful daughter, and countless family dinners. Yet somehow I was still the outsider who had schemed her way into their perfect family." I felt the floor shift beneath me as every insecurity I'd ever pushed down came rushing back. But I had no idea that before dessert was served, my 11-year-old daughter would uncover a truth that had been hidden for over a decade. A truth that would forever change how this family saw me. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, formerly Sarah Winters before I married Richard Mitchell 12 years ago. I grew up in Burlington, a small town outside of Seattle, where most people worked at the paper mill or commuted to the city. My father fixed cars at the local garage, and my mother taught second grade at Burlington Elementary. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with faded blue siding and a porch swing, where I spent countless summer evenings reading books from the library. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and filled with laughter. I was the first in my family to go to college, working evenings as a waitress to supplement my scholarship. My parents were so proud when I graduated with my degree in psychology, even prouder when I went on to get my master's in counseling. They believed education was the door to opportunities they never had, and they were right, just not in the way any of us expected. I met Richard during my final year of graduate school. I was interning at University Hospital in their adolescent mental health program, and he was a second-year pediatric resident with kind eyes and a laugh that made me feel instantly at home. We met in the hospital cafeteria when we both reached for the last apple in the fruit basket. He insisted I take it. I suggested we split it. By the time we finished that apple, sitting at a corner table long after we should have returned to our respective departments, I knew he was different from anyone I'd ever met. Richard came from a world I'd only seen in magazines, private schools, European vacations, family friends whose names appeared on buildings. His father, Tom, was a senior partner at one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. His mother, Barbara, on the board of the city's major cultural institutions. Their home overlooked Lake Washington, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the water like a living painting. The first time Richard took me there for dinner, I wore my best dress, a navy blue wrap dress I'd splurged on from Nordstrom Rack. I spent an hour on my hair and makeup, practiced small talk in the mirror, and brought a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I wanted so badly to make a good impression. I'll never forget the way Barbara looked at me when Richard introduced us, her eyes moving from my face to my hands to my shoes, taking inventory of everything. I wasn't. She smiled politely and said, "Richard has told us so little about you," managing to make it sound like my fault, like I was a secret he was keeping rather than someone he was proud to introduce. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle disapproval. Tom asked about my family with the clinical detachment of someone interviewing a subject for a study. Barbara mentioned Richard's ex-girlfriend Charlotte no fewer than 4 times, Charlotte who was now at Harvard Medical School, Charlotte whose parents summered with them in the San Juan Islands, Charlotte who had apparently been like family since childhood. "Sarah is a counselor," Richard said enthusiastically, squeezing my hand under the table. "She works with teenagers in crisis. She's amazing at connecting with kids everyone else has given up on." Barbara nodded, taking a small sip of wine. "How rewarding that must be. Though I imagine the compensation isn't quite what you'd earn in private practice." Not a question, a judgment. "I'm not really in it for the money," I said, immediately regretting how defensive it sounded. "Well, of course not, dear," Barbara replied. "That's admirable." By dessert, I had counted 17 subtle digs about my background, my career, my appearance. each one delivered with a smile so practiced that I began to doubt myself. Was I being too sensitive? Was I imagining the undercurrent of disapproval? Richard didn't seem to notice. He was animated, telling stories about our dates, laughing about how we'd met. He seemed genuinely blind to his mother's cool assessment or his father's dismissive questions. Later, when I gently pointed out a particularly cutting comment Barbara had made about my ethnic-looking jewelry, a pair of silver earrings my grandmother had given me, Richard looked surprised. "That's just how Mom talks," he said. "She didn't mean anything by it." That was my first glimpse of the dynamic that would shape our relationship with his family for years to come. Richard, raised in an environment where appearance mattered more than substance, had learned to tune out the subtle cruelties. They washed over him like background noise, but for me, each one landed with the precision of a dart. Still, I fell in love with Richard, not because of his family's wealth or status. In fact, despite it. I loved his genuine compassion for his young patients, the way he explained complex medical issues to frightened parents with such patience. I loved how he could quote poetry and scientific journals with equal enthusiasm. I loved that he saw beauty in ordinary things. A perfect apple, a sunset over the hospital parking lot, the way raindrops gathered on leaves after a storm. We dated for just over a year before he proposed. It wasn't a grand, Instagram-worthy moment, just the two of us on a hike, sitting on a fallen log overlooking a valley bursting with wildflowers. He told me I made him want to be braver, more authentic. He said he loved the way I saw people, really saw them, beyond their mistakes or their pain. He asked if I would build a life with him. I said yes without hesitation. I had never been more certain of anything. The reaction from his family was immediate and revealing. "Are you sure about this?" Barbara asked him over dinner the following week. Not congratulations, not welcome to the family. "Are you sure?" Tom was more direct. "You're still young, Richard. Just finishing your residency. There's a whole world of opportunities ahead of you." He glanced at me. Opportunities that might be limited by rushing into marriage. I sat there, the new engagement ring feeling suddenly heavy on my finger as they discussed my future husband's potential as if I weren't present. Richard defended our decision, but gently, carefully, never directly confronting the obvious implication that I was somehow beneath their son. The wedding planning became a battlefield of passive aggression. Barbara had opinions about everything: the venue, the country club where Richard had grown up sailing, the guest list, heavy on family connections, light on my childhood friends, the menu, no consideration for my father's shellfish allergy. Every choice became a negotiation, with Barbara presenting her preferences as obvious wisdom and my ideas as quaint but impractical. "Wouldn't you rather have orchids, dear? Wildflowers? Are so casual," she'd say, her voice dripping with condescension. Or, "A live band is really the only acceptable choice. DJs are for proms, not Mitchell family weddings." Richard tried to mediate, but he'd been navigating his mother's expectations his entire life. The path of least resistance was deeply worn. "Maybe Mom has a point about the centerpieces," he'd offer, trying to keep the peace. By the time our wedding day arrived, I felt like a guest at someone else's event. The only part that felt truly mine was the moment when my father walked me down the aisle, whispering, "You look beautiful, Sarah Bear," using my childhood nickname with such tenderness that tears sprang to my eyes. During the reception, I overheard Barbara talking to her sister. "She seems nice enough, I suppose," she said, not realizing I was just around the corner. "But she's clearly starstruck by the family. You should have seen how quickly she agreed to have the wedding here instead of that barn she initially wanted." I just hope Richard doesn't wake up in 5 years wondering what he's done. I stood frozen, the champagne in my hand suddenly bitter. On my wedding day, in my wedding dress, I was still the gold digger who had somehow tricked their son. I didn't tell Richard what I'd heard. It was our wedding night. What would be the point? Instead, I tucked it away with all the other little wounds, convincing myself that time would change things. That once Barbara and Tom really knew me, they'd see I loved their son for himself, not for his family name or future earning potential.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Looking back, I realized that was the beginning of a pattern. Me swallowing my hurt, Richard oblivious to the subtle warfare, and his parents growing increasingly bold in their dismissal of me. The first few years of our marriage were a strange contradiction. With Richard, I was happier than I'd ever been. We moved into a small but charming house in a neighborhood we could actually afford on our combined salaries. We planted a garden, adopted a rescue dog named Cooper, and spent weekends exploring hiking trails or trying new restaurants. Richard finished his residency and joined a pediatric practice he loved. I continued my work as a counselor, eventually taking a position at a local high school where I could make a real difference in students' lives. But every interaction with his family reopened the wound of not belonging. Sunday dinners at their home became exercises in endurance. Barbara would compliment me in ways designed to emphasize our differences. "That's a lovely dress, Sarah. So refreshing to see something accessible." Or she'd reminisce about family vacations or traditions with a pointed, "That was before your time, of course." Tom was less subtle. He'd question Richard about career moves, investments, future plans, all while excluding me from the conversation. "Have you thought more about that partnership opportunity?" he'd ask. "A man in your position needs to think about long-term security." The implication being that Richard's position included supporting a wife who clearly hadn't married him for his pedigree medical career. When I became pregnant 3 years into our marriage, the dynamic shifted again. Barbara was suddenly interested in my health, my diet, my birth plan, not out of concern for me, but because I was carrying a Mitchell grandchild, the future heir to their legacy. "You're planning a natural birth?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "Well, I suppose that's brave. I had the best obstetrician in Seattle for Richard. He was worth every penny." My pregnancy was difficult. Severe morning sickness left me hospitalized twice for dehydration. When complications developed in my 3rd trimester, requiring bed rest for the final 8 weeks, Barbara didn't offer to help. Instead, she sent a professional cleaning service to our home twice a week, a gesture that managed to be both generous and insulting, implying our house wouldn't be suitable for a newborn without intervention. Emily Rose Mitchell arrived after 27 hours of labor, beautiful and perfect with a dusting of dark hair and her father's chin. The moment they placed her on my chest, I felt a fierce, protective love unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This child would never doubt her worth. She would never apologize for existing. She would know she belonged, completely and unconditionally. Barbara and Tom arrived at the hospital with an enormous floral arrangement and a silver rattle from Tiffany's. They cooed over Emily, commenting on how she had Richard's features, thank goodness, and speculating about which prestigious preschool we should consider. Richard beamed with pride, exhausted but elated. I smiled through gritted teeth, too drained from childbirth to challenge their presumption. The early years of Emily's life brought a strange truce. Barbara was determined to be the perfect grandmother, showering Emily with expensive gifts and offering unsolicited advice on everything from swaddling techniques to developmental milestones. Richard slept through the night at 6 weeks, she'd mention casually. "Have you tried the sleep training method in that book I sent?" But something unexpected happened as Emily grew from infant to toddler to little girl. She became my greatest ally, without even realizing it. When Barbara would make a subtle dig at our modest home, Emily would pipe up with, "I love our house because Mommy painted stars on my ceiling." When Tom would dominate conversations with talk of investments and business connections, Emily would climb into my lap and ask me to tell a story instead. By the time Emily was 5, she had developed a finely tuned sense of justice. "Why does Grandma always act like you don't know things, Mommy?" she asked after one Sunday dinner. "You know lots of things. You know more about feelings than anybody." I tried to explain family dynamics in terms a kindergartner could understand. "Sometimes grown-ups have different ideas about what's important," I said carefully. "Grandma and Grandpa grew up differently than I did." Emily considered this seriously. "Do they think having lots of money makes them better?" Out of the mouths of babes. "Some people think that way," I acknowledged. "But what do you think is important?" "Being kind," she said immediately. "And funny, and making people feel better when they're sad, like you do." In that moment, I realized something crucial. While I couldn't change Barbara and Tom's perception of me, I could ensure Emily grew up with different values. I could show her through my actions what truly mattered. And perhaps most importantly, I could protect her from the subtle poison of their judgment. Richard's relationship with his parents remained complicated. He loved them, respected them, and in many ways still sought their approval, even while building a life that diverged from their expectations. He'd defend me when their comments crossed a line even he couldn't ignore, but he rarely noticed the everyday paper cuts of their disapproval. "You're too sensitive," he'd say sometimes. "That's just how they talk. They don't mean anything by it." But the thing about paper cuts is that they accumulate. Year after year, holiday after holiday, Sunday dinner after Sunday dinner, they build up until even the smallest new cut feels unbearable. Which brings me back to that Thanksgiving Day, 12 years into our marriage. Barbara and Tom had arrived from Seattle 3 days earlier, bringing with them an atmosphere of evaluation and critique. Barbara had rearranged my kitchen cupboards while I was at work, explaining that her system was much more efficient. Tom had questioned our decision to stay in our starter home rather than moving to a more prestigious neighborhood. "Emily's school district is excellent," I'd explained for the 100th time. "And we love this house. We've made it our home." Tom had shaken his head. A man in Richard's position should be thinking about appearances. Perception matters in professional circles. By Thanksgiving Day itself, I was stretched thin from maintaining a cheerful facade. I'd been up since dawn preparing the meal, turkey with all the traditional sides, plus Richard's favorite bourbon pecan pie. Emily had helped me set the table, carefully placing the name cards she'd decorated beside each plate. We sat down to dinner at 2 o'clock. The conversation flowed pleasantly at first. Neutral topics like Emily's science project, Richard's recent conference in Boston, the unusually mild November weather. But then Barbara, already on her second glass of wine, turned the conversation to family history. "Did I ever tell you about Richard's great-grandmother?" she asked Emily. "She was a Carnegie before she married. Very well connected. That's where Richard gets his natural grace in social situations." I passed the cranberry sauce, biting my tongue. This was another of Barbara's favorite tactics, emphasizing Richard's illustrious lineage, implicitly highlighting the absence of such distinction in my background. "Sarah's family has interesting history too," Richard offered, surprising me with his awareness. "Her grandfather was a master carpenter who helped rebuild after the 1962 Columbus Day storm." Barbara smiled tightly. "How resourceful." "Mom was the first person in her family to go to college," Emily added proudly. "And she graduated with honors." Barbara nodded, taking another sip of wine. "Yes, Richard mentioned that. It's so admirable when people pull themselves up from humble beginnings." I focused on cutting my turkey into perfectly even pieces, counting silently to keep my composure. 1, 2, 3. "Of course," Barbara continued, her voice taking on a reminiscent quality that immediately put me on alert. "Richard had so many options before he settled down. Charlotte Winters is chief of pediatric surgery at Mass General now. And there was that lovely girl from Vanderbilt. What was her name, Tom? Rebecca, Tom supplied. Rebecca Harrington. Her father's on the Federal Reserve Board. 10, 11, 12. Such accomplished young women, Barbara sighed. But then, timing is everything, isn't it? Richard was just finishing his residency, vulnerable, exhausted, working those horrible shifts. She turned to me, her smile not reaching her eyes. You were so persistent, so available. The table went quiet. Emily looked up from her plate, confusion clouding her expression. Richard froze, fork midway to his mouth. What do you mean, Mother? He asked, his voice careful. Barbara waved her hand dismissively. Oh, nothing negative, dear. Sarah saw an opportunity and took it. That's to be commended, really. An opportunity? I echoed, unable to stay silent any longer. We've always known, she said, swirling her wine glass. A small-town girl from a broken home, seeing your chance with a boy from a good family, headed for a prestigious medical career. She looked at Richard, her voice dripping with maternal concern. You were too kind-hearted to see what was happening. The accusation hung in the air, alongside the scent of sage and roasted turkey. 12 years of marriage reduced to a calculated scheme. 12 years of loving Richard, building a life together, raising our daughter, all dismissed as the long con of a social climber. I looked at Richard, waiting for him to defend me, to challenge the narrative his mother had just presented as fact. He sat there, silent, looking down at his plate like it might offer him some escape. That's when Tom decided to chime in, leaning back in his chair, his expensive watch catching the light as he gestured dismissively. Well, he said with a practiced sigh, at least she gave you Emily. They exchanged knowing looks across my carefully set table, like our daughter was the only worthwhile thing I'd contributed to the family. Like being Richard's wife was some prize I'd unfairly claimed. I felt like the air had been sucked from the room, but I didn't say anything then. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of them. I just turned and picked up Emily's handmade place card from the table, the one she'd decorated with little turkeys and hearts, and walked straight to the kitchen because I needed a moment alone. Away from their judgment. Away from Richard's silence. I didn't know then that Emily had followed me. I didn't realize she'd heard every word, seen her father's failure to respond. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her cheeks flushed. Mom, she whispered, why did Grandma say that about you? And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. She will never think she was the reason for their cruelty. She will never believe I used her to trap anyone. Let Barbara and Tom think what they wanted. I'd protect Emily from their version of our family story. The version where her mother was a calculating gold digger instead of a woman who had simply fallen in love. But there in the kitchen, with my daughter's questioning eyes on me, I couldn't find the right words. How do you explain decades of class prejudice and family dysfunction to an 11-year-old? How do you defend yourself against accusations of manipulation without sounding defensive? Your grandmother and grandfather have a very different view of the world than I do, I said finally, kneeling to meet her eyes. They think certain things are important, like family background and money, that I don't think define a person's worth. Emily's brow furrowed. But why did she say you trapped Dad? I took a deep breath. Because she can't understand why your dad would choose someone like me unless there was some trick involved. But there wasn't a trick, Emmy. Your dad and I fell in love. That's the whole story. Emily nodded slowly, processing this. Then she said something that broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. Dad should have said something. He should have told Grandma she was wrong. Out of the mouths of babes again. Yes, I agreed softly. He should have. Little did I know that Emily wasn't just empathizing with my pain. She was formulating a plan. A plan that would bring to light a truth that had been hidden for years. A truth that would force everyone in our family to reconsider the narrative they'd accepted for so long. And it would all begin with a cigar box full of letters from a man who had seen me clearly when no one else would. I returned to the dining room with my shoulders back and head high, determined not to give Barbara the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Emily trailed behind me, her small face set in an expression I recognized, the same determined look she wore before soccer games or difficult tests. A look that said she was preparing for something. Richard glanced up as we re-entered, his eyes apologetic but his mouth still silent. Tom had moved on to discussing the stock market, as if he hadn't just participated in humiliating me in my own home. Barbara was cutting her turkey into precise, tiny squares, a self-satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Emily," she said brightly, as if nothing had happened. "Tell me about that science competition your school is hosting, the one you mentioned yesterday." Emily sat down slowly, her eyes moving from Barbara to Tom to her father. Then she looked at me. Something passed between us, a current of understanding, of solidarity. She turned back to her grandmother. "Actually, Grandma," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, "I'd rather talk about what you just said about my mom." The room went still. Barbara's fork hovered in midair. "Emily," Richard began, his tone cautioning. "No, Dad," Emily interrupted, setting her napkin on the table. "Grandma said Mom trapped you. What does that mean? How do you trap someone into marriage?" Barbara's cheeks flushed pink. "Emily, dear, adult conversations are complicated. I was simply pointing out that your mother was very determined when she met your father." "Determined how?" Emily pressed, her voice innocent but her eyes sharp. Tom cleared his throat. "Perhaps this isn't appropriate dinner conversation." "Why not?" Emily asked. "You were just talking about it. Right in front of me." She turned to Richard. "Dad, did Mom trap you? Is that why you married her?" Richard finally found his spine. "No, Emmy, absolutely not. I married your mother because I love her. I've always loved her." He shot a pointed look at his mother, and any suggestion otherwise is simply wrong. "Then why didn't you say that when Grandma said it?" Emily asked, the simple logic of childhood cutting through the adult pretense. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I wanted to rescue him, to smooth over the moment as I'd done countless times before. But something stopped me. My daughter was asking a fair question, one I'd swallowed for years. Why didn't he defend me? Why did he allow his parents to undermine and dismiss me year after year? "I should have," Richard admitted finally, his voice quiet. "You're right, Emmy. I should have said something immediately." Barbara set down her wine glass with a sharp click against the table. "This is ridiculous. We're simply expressing concern. That's been evident to everyone from the beginning." Richard was on a certain trajectory before he met Sarah. He had options, connections. "He still has options and connections," I pointed out, finding my voice at last. "He's a respected pediatrician who loves his work. He has a family who loves him. What exactly did I derail?" "You wouldn't understand," Barbara said dismissively. "You didn't grow up with certain expectations." "You mean I didn't grow up rich?" I translated flatly. Tom leaned forward. "We've provided Richard with every advantage. The best schools, the right introductions, opportunities most people can only dream of. We wanted him to make the most of those advantages." "By marrying someone with the right pedigree?" I asked. "By making choices that would enhance, not limit, his potential," Tom corrected, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. Emily watched this exchange with a furrowed brow. Then she pushed back her chair. "I need to get something," she announced. "Don't start dessert without me." Before anyone could respond, she hurried from the dining room. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the creak of her bedroom door. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Richard reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture that felt too little, too late. "Sarah," he began, his voice low. "I'm sorry. They don't speak for me." "But you let them speak," I replied quietly. "For 12 years you've let them speak." Barbara sniffed. "I don't see why you're so offended. Many women would be flattered that we think you were clever enough to secure a husband like Richard." The casual cruelty of her words struck me speechless. In Barbara's worldview, my love for Richard couldn't possibly be genuine. My only value was in whatever calculation she imagined I'd made. Before I could respond, Emily returned, clutching a weathered cigar box to her chest. Her face was solemn but determined as she approached the table. "I was going to wait until Christmas," she said, "but I think we need this now." Richard looked at the box curiously. "What's that, Emmy?" "I found it last summer at Great-Grandpa." "James's lake house," she explained. "When you and Mom were fixing the dock, and Grandma and Grandpa took me inside because it was too hot." Barbara's expression shifted subtly at the mention of James, Richard's paternal grandfather who had passed away 2 years earlier. James had been different from the rest of the Mitchell family. Warmer, more genuine, less concerned with appearances. He'd owned a successful construction company, building it from nothing after returning from the Korean War. Though wealthy by any reasonable standard, he'd never adopted the pretensions that Barbara embraced so enthusiastically. "You were in Grandpa James's study?" Tom asked, his tone sharpening. "We've told you that room is private, Emily." Emily nodded. "I know. I was looking for a book to read, and I accidentally knocked over some papers on his desk. When I was picking them up, I found this box in the drawer." She set it carefully on the table between her grandparents. "It's full of letters." Barbara glanced at the box without touching it. James was always scribbling something or other. Notes about building projects, most likely. "They're not about buildings," Emily said. "They're about us, about Mom." She turned to me. "About how much Great-Grandpa James liked you." My heart squeezed. James had been the one member of Richard's family who had treated me with unconditional warmth from the beginning. He'd attended our wedding in a rumpled suit, hugged me fiercely, and whispered, "He chose well." When Emily was born, he'd driven to the hospital alone, against Barbara's protests about his age and eyesight, bringing a handmade wooden cradle that had been in the family for generations. "May I?" Richard asked, reaching for the box. Emily nodded, but placed her hand on top of his. "I think Grandma and Grandpa should hear them first. Great-Grandpa wrote them these letters, but he never sent them." Tom frowned. "Letters to us? Why wouldn't he have sent them?" "I think he was afraid to hurt your feelings," Emily said simply, "but they're important." She opened the box and pulled out a bundle of envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the handwriting on the front was clear and strong, James's distinctive script addressing each envelope to Tom and Barbara Mitchell. Emily selected an envelope from the middle of the stack and carefully opened it. "This one is from right after Mom and Dad got married. Can I read it?" Without waiting for permission, she unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dear Barbara and Tom, I'm writing this after returning from Richard and Sarah's wedding, though I doubt I'll ever have the courage to send it. The way you behaved today, your cold response to Sarah's vows, your visible disapproval during their first dance, it breaks my heart. You are so blinded by what you wanted for Richard that you cannot see what he has found. A woman of extraordinary character." Barbara's face drained of color. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Emily continued reading. "I've watched Sarah these past 2 years. I've seen her love for Richard, not for his potential income or family connections as you've suggested, but for his compassion, his humor, his heart. I've seen her encourage him when he doubted his path in medicine. I've heard her ask him questions no one else bothers to ask. I felt tears building behind my eyes as Emily's clear voice continued. And I've watched you dismiss her because she doesn't fit the mold you created. Because her father was a mechanic and not a surgeon. Because she chose to work with struggling teenagers instead of pursuing a more suitable career. You are making a terrible mistake, and someday you may recognize what you've lost. The chance to truly know your son and the remarkable woman he loves. Emily looked up. There's more. Great-grandpa wrote to you every year. After Mom finished her master's degree while working full-time. After Dad's fellowship when Mom managed everything at home. After I was born and Mom had complications. She turned a page. He wrote this when I was 5. I watched Sarah today at the lake, teaching Emily to swim. Her patience, her gentleness, her quiet strength, all qualities you seem determined to overlook. Richard looks at his wife with such pride, such certainty. He chose well, better than you or I could have chosen for him. When will you finally see that? The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, a lone car passed on our quiet street. The heating system clicked on with a soft hum. But at our table, not even a breath seemed to stir the air. Barbara was the first to move, reaching for her wine glass with a hand that trembled slightly. Emily, she said, her voice strained for casualness. These are private family matters. Perhaps we should discuss them another time. No, Richard's voice was firm. I want to hear them. He turned to Emily. Are there more? Emily nodded, pulling another letter from the bundle. This one is from Thanksgiving 7 years ago. Great-grandpa writes, I watched in silence again today as you undermined Sarah at every turn. Your comments about her upbringing, her career choices, even the way she carves a turkey. Nothing escapes your criticism. Yet she responds with grace. I'm not sure I could muster in her position. Have you noticed how she never retaliates? How she ensures Emily only hears positive things about her grandparents despite your behavior? That is character, Barbara. That is strength. Tom cleared his throat. James always was a bit dramatic. He didn't understand our concerns. What concerns exactly? Richard interrupted, an edge to his voice I'd rarely heard. That Sarah comes from a working-class family? That she chose a career helping others instead of accumulating status? What terrible fate were you protecting me from? Tom's mouth tightened. You had opportunities, connections we'd cultivated your entire life. Marriage is a partnership that can either elevate or limit one's potential. And you think Sarah has limited me? Richard asked incredulously. Look around, Barbara interjected, gesturing to our modest dining room. You could have been chief of pediatrics by now. You could be living in Madison Park, serving on hospital boards, establishing yourself as a leader in your field. Instead, you work at a small practice, live in this starter home, and seem content with mediocrity. I flinched at her words, but Richard laughed, actually laughed out loud. That's what this has always been about, isn't it? Your definition of success. Your vision for my life. He shook his head. Did it ever occur to you that I love my small practice because I get to really know my patients? That we chose this house because it's in an excellent school district and a neighborhood where kids actually play outside? That I measure success by whether I'm making a difference, not by the square footage of my home? You were raised for more, Barbara insisted. I was raised for this, Richard countered, to find meaningful work, to create a family filled with love, to be an honest, decent man. He looked at me, his expression softening. Sarah hasn't limited me. She's helped me become the person I actually want to be, not the person you planned for me to be. Emily had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. Now she pulled one final envelope from the bottom of the stack. Great-grandpa wrote one more letter before he died, she said quietly. It's addressed to Dad, not to Grandma and Grandpa. Richard took the envelope from her with gentle hands. The return address showed it had been written just a month before James passed away. He opened it carefully and began to read, his voice growing thick with emotion. My dear Richard, as I face the end of my days, I find myself thinking of beginnings. Yours with Sarah, specifically. I remember the first time you brought her to meet me. She wasn't what I expected. She was better. While Tom and Barbara saw only what she lacked in pedigree, I saw what she possessed in abundance, integrity, intelligence, and a genuine love for you that had nothing to do with your family name or prospects. For years, I've written letters to your parents that I've never had the courage to send. Letters expressing my disappointment in how they've treated the woman you love. Letters documenting the small cruelties I've witnessed, the dismissals, the subtle undermining of a marriage that has brought you evident joy. I've kept silent too long, and that silence makes me complicit. So I'm writing to you directly now, while I still can. Your parents are wrong about Sarah. They have always been wrong. The metrics by which they measure value, social status, family connections, financial potential, are hollow. I built my company from nothing after returning. From a war that taught me the only things of real value are love, integrity, and the courage to live authentically. Sarah embodies those qualities. I've watched her love you steadfastly despite your parents' disapproval. I've seen her raise Emily with values that matter: kindness, honesty, curiosity. I've observed her extend grace to Barbara and Tom when they've shown her none. I fear you don't fully recognize what's happening. Perhaps you've grown so accustomed to your parents' behavior that it seems normal. It is not normal, Richard. It is not kind. And your silence when they undermine Sarah makes you part of the problem. Stand up for your wife, not just when the offense is egregious, but every time. Let your parents know their behavior is unacceptable. It may not change them, but it will change you. And it will show Sarah and Emily that you truly see their worth. You chose well, Richard. Better than you know. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise, not even the parents who raised you. With love and hope, Grandpa James. Richard's voice broke on the final words. He set the letter down and looked up at his parents, then at me. He was right, Richard said quietly. About everything. I've been so conditioned to keep the peace that I've allowed you both to disrespect my wife for our entire marriage. He turned to me, his eyes shining with tears. Sarah, I'm so sorry. There's no excuse. I reached across the table and took his hand, my own vision blurring. All these years, I'd thought I was alone in seeing the reality of how Barbara and Tom treated me. But James had seen, and he'd documented it all, letter by letter, year by year. This is absurd, Barbara said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. James was an old man, sentimental, confused toward the end. He wasn't confused, Emily countered with the straightforward certainty of childhood. He saw how you treat Mom. He just didn't want to hurt your feelings by telling you that you were being mean. Tom pushed back from the table abruptly. I think we've had enough discussion for one holiday. Emily, these letters were private. You had no right. They were addressed to you, Emily pointed out. Great-grandpa wanted you to read them. He just didn't send them. She looked at her grandmother. He wrote that he was afraid of hurting your feelings, but I think you hurt Mom's feelings all the time and don't care. The brutal honesty of her observation hung in the air like a physical presence. Barbara opened her mouth, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words, perhaps for the first time in her life. Richard stood up. Mom, Dad, I think it would be best if you packed your things tonight. We can discuss this further once. Everyone has had a chance to process. Tom's face darkened. You're asking us to leave? Over some old letters? I'm asking you to leave because I need time to think, Richard clarified. And because, for once, I'm prioritizing my wife's feelings over your convenience. Barbara stood as well, straightening her silk blouse with shaking hands. "If that's what you want." Her voice was tight, controlled. "We'll get a hotel room." "I'll help you pack," Richard said firmly. As they left the dining room, an uncomfortable silence descended. Emily looked at me uncertainly. "Mom, are you mad at me for showing the letters? I was going to wait until Christmas, but..." I moved around the table and pulled her into a tight hug. "No, honey, I'm not mad. What you did was brave." I pulled back to look at her face. "How did you know what the letters said?" She shrugged. "I read them at the lake house. I was going to put them back, but then I heard Grandma saying those things about you to her friend on the phone. About how you weren't from the right background. About how Dad could have done better." Her young face hardened. It made me so mad. And then I remembered Great-Grandpa's letters, and I thought everybody should know the truth. I hugged her, again, marveling at her perception and courage. "Thank you for standing up for me." "Great-Grandpa said we should always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "He told me that the summer before he died, when we were fishing off the dock." Of course he had. James had recognized in Emily the same integrity he'd valued his entire life. He'd seen her clearly, just as he'd seen me. I heard movement upstairs, footsteps, drawers opening and closing, the low murmur of voices too indistinct to make out. Richard was helping his parents pack, ending their Thanksgiving visit 3 days early. Part of me felt guilty for disrupting the holiday, but a larger part felt something unfamiliar. Vindication. After 12 years of calculated slights and dismissals, the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Emily pulled away from our hug. "Is Thanksgiving ruined?" she asked worriedly. I smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "No, sweetheart. Nothing's ruined. It's just changing. Sometimes families need to have hard conversations so they can heal." "Will Grandma and Grandpa hate me now?" Her voice was small. "No," I said firmly. "They won't hate you. They might be embarrassed or upset for a while, but they love you. This isn't about you." I started clearing the table, gathering plates that still held half-eaten food. Emily helped, scraping leftovers into the trash with a subdued expression. That broke my heart. This should have been a celebration, not a confrontation that ended with family members leaving abruptly. "Hey," I said, setting down the stack of plates. "How about we have dessert on the couch and watch a movie? Just the 3 of us. We still have pie." Emily's face brightened slightly. "Can we watch Elf? I know it's not Christmas yet, but it always makes me laugh." "Absolutely," I agreed. Pie and Elf sounds perfect. By the time Richard came downstairs 30 minutes later, Emily and I were curled up on the couch with slices of bourbon pecan pie, the opening credits of the movie, playing on the TV. His face was drawn, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "They're gone?" I asked softly. He nodded, sinking into the armchair beside us. "They're checking into the Marriott downtown. They'll fly back to Seattle in the morning." "Are you okay?" I studied his face, trying to read the emotions there. He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I don't even have words for what I feel." He looked at the TV screen, then at Emily, who was watching him with concerned eyes. "But I think we need this. Just us. A reset." I cut him a slice of pie and handed it over. He accepted it gratefully, then noticed the cigar box on the coffee table where Emily had placed it. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. Emily nodded. "They're your family's letters." Richard set his pie aside and opened the box again, lifting out the bundle of envelopes. "There must be at least 20 letters here," he murmured, turning. Them over in his hands. 23, Emily confirmed. "Great-Grandpa wrote one every year after you and Mom got married, except the year he was in the hospital with pneumonia." Richard looked at his daughter with a mixture of wonder and regret. You read them all? She nodded solemnly. Last summer. It took me 3 days. Some of the words were hard. And you kept them all this time, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't a question. I was going to give them to you for Christmas, she explained. I made a special box and everything. But then Grandma said those things, and you didn't say anything, and Mom looked so sad. Her voice trailed off. Richard reached out and took her hand. You did the right thing, Emmy. The exact right thing. He glanced at me. Your mom and I should have done a better job protecting you from all of this. We should have been more honest about Grandma and Grandpa's behavior. I knew anyway, Emily said simply. Kids always know when grown-ups are being fake nice. Out of the mouths of babes. We watched the movie in companionable silence, the tension of dinner gradually dissipating as Will Ferrell's antics filled the screen. Emily fell asleep before the ending, her head on my lap, her breathing deep and even. I stroked her hair, marveling at the courage and wisdom in this child we'd raised. When the credits rolled, Richard switched off the TV and carefully lifted Emily into his arms. I'll put her to bed, he whispered. I nodded, gathering the empty dessert plates. By the time I'd loaded the dishwasher and wiped down the counters, erasing the last traces of our disrupted Thanksgiving dinner, Richard had returned to the living room. He was sitting on the couch, James's letters spread around him, his expression troubled. I've read through half of them, he said as I joined him. My grandfather documented every slight, every undermining comment, every time my parents made, "You feel less than," for 12 years. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt validated that someone else had seen what I'd experienced, but another part ached for Richard, forced to confront his parents' behavior in such an undeniable way. Why didn't you tell me how bad it was? He asked, his voice strained. All these years? I sighed, gathering my thoughts. I tried in the beginning, but you always defended them. That's just Mom's way. Dad doesn't mean anything by it. After a while, I started doubting myself. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe it was normal for in-laws to be this way. It's not normal, Richard said firmly. It's not acceptable. He picked up one of the letters, dated from the year Emily was born. Grandpa James writes here about how my mother criticized your decision to breastfeed, implying you were being difficult on purpose. I don't even remember that. It was at the hospital, I said, the memory suddenly vivid. She brought a case of formula and told the nurse I'd decided not to breastfeed, even though we'd discussed it and I'd been very clear about my plans. When I corrected her, she said I was being stubborn and putting my personal preferences above the baby's needs. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I've been complicit in this for our entire marriage. You didn't see it, I said, not entirely absolving him but understanding the complexity of the situation. They're your parents. You grew up with their behavior. It seemed normal to you. That's no excuse, he countered. I should have listened when you tried to tell me. I should have paid attention to how you felt after every interaction with them. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 12 years of unspoken tension between us. What happens now? I asked finally. With your parents? Richard gathered the letters together, arranging them carefully back in the cigar box. I don't know exactly, but things have to change, fundamentally change. He looked at me directly. I won't allow them to treat you that way anymore, and I won't be silent when they try. It was what I'd wanted to hear for 12 years, but now that the moment had arrived, I felt strangely hollow. I never wanted to come between you and your parents, Richard. You didn't, he said firmly. Their behavior created this situation, not you. And my silence made it worse. He reached for my hand. I've failed you in this, Sarah, for years. But I promise you, that ends tonight. I leaned against his shoulder, emotionally drained from the day's events. I still can't believe Emily had those letters all this time. That she understood what they meant. She's remarkable, Richard agreed. Perceptive, brave, principled. He smiled slightly. Like her mother. We sat together on the couch until well past midnight, talking more openly than we had in years. About his parents, about the patterns we'd fallen into, about the silent accommodations I'd made to keep the peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Those rarely exist outside of movies. But it was a beginning. A reset, as Richard had called it earlier. When we finally went upstairs to bed, I peeked into Emily's room. She was sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around the stuffed otter that had been her constant companion since kindergarten. In sleep, she looked younger than her 11 years, vulnerable in a way that squeezed my heart. She'd shouldered a burden that shouldn't have been hers. She'd recognized an injustice and found a way to address it that none of the adults in her life had managed in 12 years. All because she loved me and couldn't bear to see me hurt. As I closed her door gently, I made another silent promise. From now on, I would model the courage Emily had shown today. I would speak truth with the same clarity and conviction. Not just for my sake, but for hers. So she would grow up knowing that her voice mattered, that standing up for others was always the right choice, and that family meant supporting each other, not tearing each other down. The letters from James remained downstairs in their cigar box, physical evidence of a love and perception that had transcended the typical family dynamics. Tomorrow, Richard and I would read through the rest of them together. We would face the uncomfortable truths they contained, and we would begin the work of healing. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of our home, I felt something unfamiliar taking root inside me. Hope. Not the desperate hope I'd clung to in the early years of our marriage, that somehow Barbara and Tom would eventually accept me, but a deeper, more grounded hope. Hope that the truth, finally spoken aloud, might set all of us free from the patterns that had held us captive for so long. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of late November sunshine filtering through our bedroom curtains. For a moment, I lay still, disoriented by the unusual silence in the house. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. Barbara's accusation, Emily's revelation of James's letters, Richard finally standing up to his parents. The emotional weight of it all crashed over me anew. Richard was already awake beside me, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep, he admitted when he noticed my eyes open. I kept thinking about those letters, about how my grandfather saw what was happening all those years and I didn't, or wouldn't. I rolled onto my side to face him. James had the advantage of distance. He only saw your parents occasionally, so their behavior stood out more sharply. When you grow up with something, it becomes normal, invisible. That doesn't excuse it, Richard said firmly. I should have protected you. I should have seen what they were doing. I reached for his hand. What matters is that you see it now. He nodded, squeezing my fingers. I called the hotel this morning, before you woke up. They've already checked. Out. Their flight leaves at 11. Without saying goodbye? Richard's mouth tightened. Apparently so. My mother left a message that they thought it best to give us space. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. 12 years of undermining you, and suddenly they're concerned about giving us space. I sat up, pulling my knees to my chest. What happens now, Richard? With your parents? He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know exactly, but I know things can't go back to how they were. He looked at me directly. I won't allow them to treat you that way anymore. And I need to make that absolutely clear to them. The determination in his voice stirred something inside me, a cautious hope that maybe, after all these years, real change was possible. Downstairs, we found Emily already at the kitchen table, James's cigar box open before her, the letters arranged, in neat chronological stacks. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, kissing the top of her head. "What are you doing?" "Organizing," she replied, not looking up from her task. "I thought maybe we could make copies of the letters, so we all have them." She glanced up then, her expression serious beyond her years, in case Grandma and Grandpa try to take them away. Richard and I exchanged a look over her head. Even now, Emily was thinking strategically, protecting the evidence that had validated years of her observations. "That's a good idea," Richard said, sitting down beside her. "But your grandparents aren't going to take the letters. They're yours. You found them." Emily considered this, then nodded slightly. "They left already, didn't they? Without saying goodbye." "How did you know that?" I asked, surprised by her perception. She shrugged. "Their rental car is gone, and Grandma always says goodbye even when she's mad. She says it's what polite people do." The slight emphasis she placed on the phrase was a perfect mimicry of Barbara's tone. "They had an early flight," Richard explained, though we all knew that wasn't the real reason. Emily returned to her organizing, carefully checking dates on each envelope. "Do you think they're going to be mad at me forever?" The vulnerability in her question broke my heart. Despite everything, she still cared about her grandparents' approval. "No, honey," I assured her, sitting down on her other side. "They're embarrassed right now and probably a little angry, but they love you. They'll get over it." "But the letters showed they were wrong," Emily persisted. "Great-Grandpa James said they were wrong for years and years. Will they admit that?" Richard and I exchanged another glance. We both knew the answer was likely no. Barbara and Tom rarely admitted fault about anything, let alone something this fundamental to their worldview. "People find it very hard to admit when they've been wrong for a long time," Richard said carefully. "Especially adults. It's easier to be angry or defensive than to face the fact that you've hurt someone you should have been loving." Emily considered. This, her brow furrowed in concentration. "So they might stay mad even though they're the ones who were mean to Mom?" "They might," I acknowledged. "But that wouldn't be your fault, Emmy. You told the truth. That's always the right thing to do, even when it's hard." She nodded, satisfied with this answer for the moment. "Can we have pancakes? It's still Thanksgiving weekend." The normalcy of her request made both Richard and I smile. "Absolutely," I said, grateful for the chance to establish some ordinary routine after yesterday's upheaval. As I mixed pancake batter and Richard set the table, I marveled at the resilience of children. Despite being at the center of a family confrontation that had been brewing for 12 years, Emily's primary concerns this morning were preserving the letters and getting pancakes for breakfast. The adult world of complex resentments and unspoken tensions was still largely foreign to her 11-year-old perspective. We spent the day in a kind of quiet recovery mode. Richard and I read through the remaining letters from James, while Emily worked on a school project at the dining room table. Each letter revealed another moment when James had observed Barbara and Tom's treatment of me. Another instance when he'd wanted to speak up but had held his peace out of complicated family loyalty. One letter, written after Emily's baptism, particularly struck me. Today I watched Sarah arrange everything for Emily's special day. The flowers, the reception, the photographs, only to have Barbara step in at the last moment and rearrange it all to her liking. I watched Sarah's face as her careful planning was dismissed without a word of thanks or acknowledgement. Yet she said nothing, simply redirecting her energy to making sure everyone felt welcome and included. This quiet dignity, this refusal to engage in pettiness even when provoked, these are qualities Barbara has never possessed and apparently cannot recognize. I wish I had her strength. Richard read those words with a pained expression. I remember that day. Mom took over everything, and I thought you were fine with it because you didn't say anything. What would have been the point? I asked. It was Emily's day. Making a scene would only have created tension that everyone would remember instead of the joy of the occasion. But it was your planning, your vision for our daughter's baptism, Richard argued. You shouldn't have had to silently accept my mother steamrolling over you. I shrugged, the old habit of minimizing these incidents still strong. It's in the past now. That's exactly the problem, Richard said, his voice tight with emotion. All these moments are in the past now. Years of small cruelties that I never acknowledged or addressed. Years when you were alone in seeing what was happening. I reached across the table and took his hand. Not completely alone, James saw. Richard nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. Thank God for Grandpa James. Around mid-afternoon, Richard's phone chimed with a text message. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. It's my mother, he said. They've landed in Seattle. She says they'll call in a few days when emotions have settled. The familiar phrases, deflecting, minimizing, placing the blame on emotions rather than their behavior, made something shift inside me. For 12 years, I'd accommodated their subtle cruelty, making excuses, staying silent, doubting my own perceptions. But James's letters had confirmed what I'd always known. Their treatment of me had been deliberate and consistent. I don't want to wait for them to call, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I want to talk to them now, while everything is still fresh, before they have time to rewrite what happened or convince themselves they're the victims here. Richard looked at me with a mixture of surprise and approval. You're right. This needs to be addressed directly. He glanced at Emily, who was watching our conversation with undisguised interest. But maybe not with Emmy in the room. I nodded, understanding his concern. Despite her maturity in handling the letters, she was still a child who didn't need to witness what might become a difficult confrontation. Emily, would you be okay watching a movie in your room for a little while? I asked. Dad and I need to call Grandma and Grandpa. She considered this, then nodded. Are you going to talk about the letters? Yes, Richard confirmed. And some other things that are probably best discussed just between adults. Emily gathered her school materials with deliberate slowness. If Grandma says mean things about Mom, will you tell her to stop? Like, actually tell her? Richard knelt to meet her eyes. Absolutely, that's a promise. Satisfied, Emily headed upstairs, pausing at the landing. Can I have the iPad to watch on? Sure, I agreed, grateful for her easy acceptance of our request for privacy. Once we heard her door close, Richard took a deep breath and dialed his parents' number, putting the phone on speaker between us at the kitchen table. It rang 4 times before Barbara answered, her voice cool and controlled. Richard, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Hi, Mom. Sarah's here too. You're on speaker. A brief pause. Hello, Sarah. The greeting was perfunctory, without warmth. Barbara, I acknowledged. Is Tom there as well? He's unpacking. I'll get him. We heard her calling for her husband, then the rustle of movement as he apparently joined her. Richard, Tom's voice came through, formal and stiff. I trust you've had time to reconsider yesterday's situation. Richard looked at me, a flash of the old uncertainty crossing his face. I nodded encouragingly, reminding him without words of his promise to Emily. Actually, Dad, we're calling because we need to be very clear about what happened yesterday and what needs to change. Going forward, Richard began, his voice steady. The letters from Grandpa James confirmed what Sarah has experienced for years. A pattern of dismissal and disrespect from both of you that I've allowed to continue by staying silent. Those letters were James's personal opinions, Barbara interjected. He always was overly sentimental about these things. They were observations, Mom, specific instances where you and Dad deliberately made Sarah feel unwelcome and unworthy. Richard's voice grew firmer, and they match exactly with what Sarah has tried to tell me for years. This is ridiculous. Tom cut in. We've always treated Sarah with perfect politeness. Politeness isn't the same as respect or acceptance, I said, finding my voice. For 12 years, I've endured comments about my background, my career choices, even my parenting, all delivered with a smile that doesn't reach your eyes. If you've perceived slight where none was intended, that's hardly our fault, Barbara replied, her tone dismissive. There it is again, Richard said quietly. The suggestion that Sarah is imagining things, that she's too sensitive, that the problem is her perception rather than your behavior. A tense silence followed. What exactly do you want from us, Richard? Tom asked finally. An apology for imagined offenses? Some dramatic family reconciliation? I want acknowledgement, Richard replied. Acknowledgement that you've never fully accepted Sarah as my wife or as the mother of your grandchild. Acknowledgement that your treatment of her has been hurtful and wrong. Another silence, longer this time. And if we don't see things that way? Barbara's voice had a dangerous edge. Richard took a deep breath. Then we'll need to establish some boundaries going forward. I won't subject Sarah to any more veiled criticisms or condescending remarks. I won't allow Emily to witness her mother being treated as less than. If you can't interact with my wife respectfully, then we'll need to limit our contact. I heard Barbara's sharp intake of breath. You would restrict our access to our granddaughter because Sarah feels slighted by normal family dynamics? There's nothing normal about what happened yesterday, Mom, Richard countered. You accused my wife of trapping me into marriage. You implied that the only worthwhile thing she's ever done was giving birth to Emily. Those aren't normal family dynamics. They're cruel and fundamentally untrue. I think everyone is overreacting, Tom interjected. Barbara made one comment, perhaps poorly worded. It wasn't one comment, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. It was the culmination of 12 years of similar comments. And the fact that you can't even acknowledge that is exactly the problem. Well, Barbara said, her voice tight and controlled, I see you've made up your minds to paint us as villains in this scenario. I suppose there's nothing more to discuss. Richard closed his eyes briefly, visibly struggling with frustration. We're not asking you to accept villain status, Mom. We're asking you to consider that your behavior towards Sarah has been consistently hurtful, regardless of your intentions. Perhaps we should all take some time, Tom suggested, his lawyer's instinct for de-escalation evident. The holidays are always emotional. We can revisit this conversation after New Year's. It was the same strategy they'd always employed. Delay, minimize, redirect. Expect that time would smooth over the issue without any real accountability or change. We can talk again after the new year, Richard agreed. But I need you both to understand that things cannot continue as they have been. Sarah deserves better, and so does Emily. And so do you, Richard, I added quietly. A moment of silence followed. We'll be in touch, Barbara said finally, her voice distant. Give Emily our love. The call ended, leaving Richard and I sitting at the kitchen table, the silence heavy between us. That went about as well as could be expected, Richard said after a moment, which is to say, not well at all. I reached for his hand. It was never going to be easy. They've had decades to perfect their patterns. Do you think they heard anything we said? Really heard it? I considered the question honestly. I don't know. Maybe a little. But meaningful change would require them to reconsider fundamental aspects of how they see themselves, how they see me, how they see class and status. That's a lot to expect. Richard nodded, his expression troubled. So what now? Now, I said, giving his hand a squeeze. We go upstairs and watch a movie. With our daughter. We focus on the family we've built. and we give your parents time to decide if they want to be part of it on new terms. The rest of the weekend passed in a strange bubble of normalcy and newness. We decorated for Christmas, using the tangled strands of lights and mismatched ornaments that Barbara had always subtly criticized as charmingly homemade. We ordered pizza and watched holiday movies. Richard and I read more of James's letters, sometimes laughing, sometimes fighting tears at his perceptive observations of our family dynamics. On Sunday evening, as we were clearing dinner dishes, Emily asked, "Did you talk to Grandma and Grandpa?" Richard nodded. "We did, on Friday." "And? Are they still mad?" Richard and I exchanged a glance, silently negotiating how much to share. "They're upset," I said carefully. "Not just at you, but at the whole situation. They need some time to think about everything." Emily nodded, absorbing this. "Will they come for Christmas?" Another loaded question. Barbara and Tom had spent every Christmas with us since Emily was born, arriving with professionally wrapped presents and pointed comments about our quaint traditions. "I don't know, sweetheart," Richard admitted. "That's up to them. But either way, we'll have a wonderful Christmas." Emily seemed to accept this, returning to loading the dishwasher with uncharacteristic care. But later, as I tucked her into bed, she returned to the subject. "Mom, are you sad that Grandma and Grandpa might not come for Christmas?" I sat on the edge of her bed, considering how to answer honestly without burdening her. "I'm sad that the situation is complicated," I said finally. "I'm sad that they've never been able to see me clearly, the way Great-Grandpa James did. But mostly, I'm grateful for you and Dad, and for the truth finally being out in the open." Emily nodded, her expression serious. Great-Grandpa wrote in one of his letters that sometimes the hardest thing is telling the truth when everyone wants you to pretend. "That sounds like something he would say," I agreed, smoothing her hair. "He was a very wise man." "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa will ever understand? Like, really understand?" It was the same question Richard had asked after our phone call, and I still didn't have a definitive answer. "I don't know, honey. People can change, but usually only when they want to, when they can see that change would make their lives better." "Their lives would be better if they were nice to you," Emily pointed out with a child's straightforward logic. "Because then we could all be happy together." "That's true," I agreed. "I hope they'll come to see that." But as I turned out her light and headed back downstairs, I wasn't at all confident that Barbara and Tom would reach that conclusion. Their identity, their sense of status and propriety, was too deeply tied to their notions of who belonged in their family circle and who didn't. Richard was in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the framed family photos. On our mantel, most were casual snapshots. Emily on her first bike, the three of us hiking in the mountains, Richard and Emily building a sandcastle at the beach. But one formal portrait stood apart. A studio photograph taken when Emily was 3, with Richard, and me seated behind her, all of us dressed in coordinating outfits. "My mother arranged this photo session," Richard said when he noticed me watching him. "Remember, she had very specific ideas about what we should wear, how we should pose." I remembered. Barbara had critiqued every aspect: my hairstyle, the color of Emily's dress, the fact that Richard's tie didn't perfectly match the blue in my blouse. The photographer had been a friend of Barbara's, someone who took portraits for all the best families in Seattle. "We look stiff," Richard observed. "Uncomfortable. Not like ourselves at all." He was right. Our smiles in the formal portrait were tight, our posture unnaturally rigid. Nothing like the natural joy captured in the candid photos surrounding it. "We don't have to keep it there," I said. "We can replace it with something that feels more like us." Richard nodded slowly. "I'd like that." He set his whiskey down and took the formal portrait off the mantel, examining it more closely. "It's so strange looking back. I never questioned any of it. The formal portraits, the right schools, the appropriate career paths. I just accepted that there was a correct way to live, and my parents knew what it was. "That's how you were raised," I said, sitting beside him on the couch. "Children naturally trust their parents' view of the world. It takes time and distance to develop." "Your own perspective." Richard set the portrait face down on the coffee table. "I just keep thinking about all the moments when I should have spoken up for you. All the times I let their behavior slide because it was easier than confronting it." "You're speaking up now," I pointed out. "That's what matters." He took my hand, his expression serious. "I want you to know that I'm committed to this change, Sarah. Not just in the moment. Not just while the shock of those letters is fresh. This is permanent. I won't go back to the way things were." The certainty in his voice brought tears to my eyes. For 12 years, I'd adapted to his parents' subtle cruelty, finding ways to protect myself while preserving family harmony. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly defended, truly prioritized. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means more than you know." The next morning, Richard left early for work. A busy pediatric practice didn't pause for family drama, and Emily headed off to school with the usual Monday morning reluctance. I spent the day catching up on household tasks that had been neglected during the Thanksgiving weekend, trying not to obsess over our conversation with Barbara and Tom. Around noon, my phone chimed with a text from an unfamiliar Seattle number. "Sarah, this is Margaret Kelly, Barbara's sister. I understand there was quite a scene at Thanksgiving. Barbara is devastated. I hope you and Richard will consider how this estrangement affects the entire family. Family harmony sometimes requires overlooking minor offenses." I stared at the message, a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Of course, Barbara had already mobilized family allies, positioning herself as the victim. Of course, the issue was being framed as minor offenses, rather than years of systematic undermining. Before I could decide whether or how to respond, another text arrived. "Barbara has only ever wanted what's best for Richard and Emily. Perhaps with time and reflection, you'll see that her intentions have always been good, even if her approach has sometimes been direct." Direct. That was certainly one way to describe Barbara's behavior. I set my phone down without replying, unwilling to be drawn into defending myself to yet another family member who had already decided I was the problem. The texts from Margaret were only the beginning. By Wednesday, I'd received similar messages from 2 of Richard's cousins and an old family friend, all expressing concern about the unfortunate misunderstanding and urging reconciliation before Christmas. None acknowledged James's letters or the substance of our concerns. Richard was furious when I showed him the messages. "They're closing ranks," he said, pacing our bedroom. "Mom's mobilizing everyone to pressure us into backing down." "It's what she's always done," I pointed out. "Anytime you've challenged her on anything, she brings in reinforcements." He nodded grimly. "I'm going to call her directly. This has to stop." But before he could make the call, his phone rang, a Seattle number he didn't recognize. "Richard, Mitchell," he answered cautiously. I could hear a man's voice on the other end, though not the specific words. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Uncle Robert? Why are you calling from this number?" He listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, she's right here. Let me put you on speaker." Richard set the phone on the bed between us. "It's my Uncle Robert, my dad's younger brother." Robert Mitchell was something of a family outlier, a journalist who had spent most of his career overseas, rarely participating in family gatherings or politics. I'd met him only twice, at our wedding and at James's funeral. "Hello, Sarah." Robert's voice came through clearly. "I hope you don't mind me calling like this. I'm using a hotel phone because, well, I'd rather Barbara and Tom didn't know I was reaching out." "It's good to hear from you, Robert," I said, exchanging a puzzled glance with Richard. "Is everything okay?" "Not particularly," Robert replied with a dry chuckle. "I understand there was quite a revelation at your Thanksgiving dinner. Something about my father's letters?" Richard sat straighter. "You know about the letters?" "Not the specifics, no. But Dad told me he'd been writing them, documenting Barbara and Tom's treatment of Sarah over the years. He showed me a few, actually, before he died." "And you didn't say anything?" Richard couldn't keep the accusation from his voice. "Dad asked me not to," Robert explained. "He was torn about what to do with them. He didn't want to create a family schism in his final years, but he also couldn't bear to see how Sarah was being treated. We discussed whether he should send them to Barbara and Tom, but ultimately he decided against it." I leaned closer to the phone. "Why are you calling now, Robert?" A heavy sigh came through the line. "Because Barbara has embarked on a full-scale campaign to rewrite what happened. She's contacting everyone in the family, positioning herself as the wounded party, suggesting that you've turned Richard against his family over some perceived slight." "That's not what happened," Richard said sharply. "I know," Robert assured him. "Dad kept me well informed of the dynamics at play. That's why I'm calling, to let you know that not everyone in the family is buying Barbara's version of events." I felt a rush of unexpected relief. After days of one-sided messages supporting Barbara, it was heartening to know at least one family member recognized the reality of the situation. "What do you suggest we do?" Richard asked. "Stand your ground," Robert said firmly. "Barbara and Tom have gotten away with this behavior for years because no one has ever called them on it directly. They're counting on the usual pressure tactics to make you back down. We don't want to create a permanent rift," I said carefully. "Especially for Emily's sake." "I understand," Robert replied. "But sometimes relationships can only heal after the truth has been fully acknowledged. Dad recognized that, even if he couldn't bring himself to be the one to speak that truth." We talked for nearly an hour, with Robert sharing his own observations of Barbara and Tom's behavior over the years. As James's younger son, he'd always been somewhat sidelined in family matters, especially after he chose journalism over law or business. He understood what it was like to be measured against the Mitchell family's rigid standards and found wanting. "One more thing," Robert said as the call was winding down. "I'd like to come visit, if you're open to it. I've missed too many years with this part of the family, and it sounds like Emily is quite a remarkable young woman." "We'd love that," Richard said warmly. "Maybe after the holidays?" "Perfect. And Richard? Sarah? Dad would be proud of you both for finally addressing this. He carried a lot of guilt about staying silent." After we hung up, Richard and I sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. I had no idea Uncle Robert was so aware of the dynamics with my parents, Richard said finally. "He's always been so distant from family matters." "Maybe that distance gave him perspective," I suggested, "like James had." Richard nodded slowly. "It's strange to realize that others saw what was happening when I couldn't. Or wouldn't." I took his hand. "What matters is that you see it now." The conversation with Robert marked a turning point. Having even one ally in the Mitchell family made the prospect of navigating this new reality less daunting. It reminded me that Barbara and Tom's perspective wasn't universally shared, even among their own relatives. As Christmas approached, the question of whether Barbara and Tom would visit loomed large. Typically, they would have confirmed their travel plans weeks in advance, but this year, silence prevailed. Emily asked about it occasionally, but seemed more curious than upset by the uncertainty. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, a formal card arrived in the mail. Inside, in Barbara's elegant handwriting, "Richard, Sarah, and Emily. After much reflection, Tom and I have decided to spend the holidays at the Waterfront Club this year. We feel it best to give everyone space to process recent events. Perhaps we can arrange a brief visit after the new year when emotions have settled. With love, Mom and Dad, Grandma and Grandpa. Richard read the card twice, his expression unreadable. Well, that's that. Are you disappointed? I asked carefully. He considered the question. Not exactly. Relieved in some ways. It would have been tense, trying to navigate a holiday visit so soon after everything that happened. He looked up at me. But I'm sad for Emily. She loves Christmas traditions, even the ones my mother insists upon. We'll create our own traditions, I assured him, ones that feel authentic to us. That evening, we showed Emily the card. She studied it seriously, then handed it back to Richard. So they're not coming because they're still mad about the letters. I think they need time to think about everything, I explained. Christmas together might be complicated right now. She nodded, surprisingly accepting. Can we invite Uncle Robert instead? Dad said he might visit. Richard and I exchanged surprised glances. You heard about Uncle Robert? I was getting water when you were on the phone, she admitted. He sounds nice, and he knew great-grandpa. James. Richard smiled. He is nice. And yes, we can absolutely invite him. That night, as we lay in bed, Richard turned to me. I keep thinking about what my grandfather wrote in that final letter to me, about how I'd grown so accustomed to my parents' behavior that it seemed normal. I acknowledged, drowsy but listening. I don't want Emily to grow up thinking that's how families work. I don't want her to learn that love comes with conditions, or that she has to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. I rolled over to face him. She won't. She's already learned the opposite lesson, that speaking truth matters even when it's difficult. That's a gift, Richard, one that will serve her well her entire life. He nodded, pulling me closer. Thank you for being patient with me all these years, for not giving up on me seeing the truth. I always knew you would, eventually, I murmured. You just needed the right mirror to reflect what was happening. Thank God for Grandpa James, Richard whispered, and for Emily, and for you. Outside our window, the first snowflakes of winter drifted past, promising a white Christmas, our first in years. It felt fitting somehow, this clean slate, this fresh beginning. Whatever came next with Barbara and Tom, whether reconciliation or continued distance, we would face it together, standing firmly in our truth. And that, I realized as sleep claimed me, was the real gift Emily had given us with those letters. Not just the validation of James's words, but the freedom that comes from finally speaking truth that has too long gone unspoken. Christmas morning dawned with a pristine blanket of snow covering our neighborhood. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching the sun cast long blue shadows across untouched white. The house was still quiet, Richard and Emily not yet awake, giving me a rare moment of solitude to reflect on how much had changed in the month since Thanksgiving. For the first time in 12 years, we were celebrating Christmas without Barbara and Tom's presence. No carefully coordinated schedule dictated by Barbara's preferences. No Tom commenting on the indulgence of Emily's presence. No subtle critiques of my cooking, decorating, or gift wrapping. The absence of that familiar tension felt strange but liberating. I heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Emily, still in her pajamas, her eyes bright with Christmas excitement despite being 11, an age when some children begin to lose their holiday enthusiasm. Mom, it snowed! She pressed her bow, face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Can we open presents now, or do we have to wait for Dad? I laughed, setting my coffee down. Let's give him 5 more minutes. I think I heard him stirring. Emily nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the pile of gifts under our somewhat lopsided tree. We'd cut it ourselves at a local farm, a new tradition we'd decided to establish this year. Barbara had always insisted on a perfectly symmetrical, artificial tree with coordinated ornaments, but our living room now hosted a fragrant pine decorated with a mismatched collection of ornaments, many handmade by Emily over the years. Mom? Emily's voice pulled me from my thoughts. Is it bad that I'm kind of glad Grandma and Grandpa aren't here this Christmas? The question caught me off guard. Why do you think it might be bad? She shrugged, looking down at her slippered feet. Because they're family. And you're supposed to want family around for Christmas. I knelt beside her, choosing my words carefully. Family is important, but so is feeling comfortable and happy during special times. It's okay to recognize when certain relationships are difficult, even if they're family. Grandma always makes you tense, Emily observed. Like you're waiting for her to find something wrong. The simple accuracy of her observation struck me. That was exactly how I'd felt for years, perpetually braced for Barbara's next criticism, constantly vigilant. You notice a lot, I said. Softly. She nodded. Great-Grandpa James wrote that too, in one of his letters. He said I have uncommon perception for one so young. Before I could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, but eyes bright. Merry Christmas, my favorite people. Emily ran to him for a hug, the moment of seriousness forgotten in the excitement of Christmas morning. Dad, can we open presents now? Absolutely, Richard agreed. But first, I need coffee and a picture of us in our Christmas pajamas. The morning unfolded with a relaxed joy I couldn't remember feeling during previous holidays. We opened gifts slowly, taking time to appreciate each one rather than racing through the process with Barbara's efficient precision. Emily exclaimed over the art supplies and books we'd chosen, especially the professional-grade sketchbook that had been her most wished-for item. Around 10, the doorbell rang. Emily jumped up. That must be Uncle Robert, Robert had called. The previous week, asking if he might join us for Christmas morning. He'd never visited during the holidays before, always spending them with Barbara and Tom at their Seattle home. But this year, everything was different. When I opened the door, Robert stood there with snow dusting his shoulders, a bundle of gifts in his arms, and a tentative smile on his face. At 62, he looked remarkably like James, the same thoughtful eyes, the same slight tilt of the head when he was considering something. Merry Christmas, Sarah, he said warmly. I hope I'm not too early. You're right on time, I assured him, stepping aside to welcome him in. Emily's been watching the clock. Emily appeared in the hallway, suddenly shy in the presence of this great uncle she barely knew. Hi, Uncle Robert. He set down his packages to shake her hand formally. Hello, Emily. Thank you for inviting me to share Christmas with you. It's been a long time since I've had a proper family Christmas. You're welcome, she replied politely. Then curiosity overcame her reserve. Did you bring those for us? She pointed to the presents. Robert laughed. I did. I might have gone. A bit overboard, but it's my first Christmas as a great uncle in quite some time. Richard emerged from the kitchen with coffee for our guest. Robert, it's good to see you. The two men shook hands, a current of unspoken understanding passing between them. Both had navigated complicated relationships with Barbara and Tom, albeit in different ways. As we settled in the living room, I noticed Robert taking in our decorations, our casual atmosphere, the remnants of wrapping paper still scattered on the floor. All so different from the formal Christmas gatherings at the Mitchell family home. This is nice, he said simply. Real. Emily, overcoming her initial shyness, peppered Robert with questions about his life as a journalist, his travels around the world, whether he'd met any famous people. He answered each query with thoughtful attention, treating her with the same seriousness he might afford an adult interviewer. After a while, Emily showed him her cigar box of letters, carefully organized and preserved. These are Great-Grandpa James's letters, the ones I found at the lake house. Robert handled them with reverence. Dad mentioned he was documenting things. I saw a few, but not all of these. Did you know what Grandma and Grandpa were doing? To Mom, I mean? Emily asked directly. Robert glanced at Richard and me, clearly wondering how candid he should be with her. It's okay, Richard assured him. We've been honest with Emily about everything." Robert nodded, turning back to Emily. "Yes, I knew. Not every detail, but I saw enough when I'd visit. Dad and I discussed it often. He was troubled by how they treated your mom." "Then why didn't you say something?" The directness of Emily's question might have seemed rude from another child, but there was no accusation in her tone, just genuine curiosity. Robert didn't seem offended. "That's a fair question. I should have spoken up more forcefully. But I was the family outsider in many ways, living overseas, rarely visiting. When I did raise concerns, Tom and Barbara dismissed them, as evidence that I didn't understand family values." He smiled wryly. "I let myself be silenced when I should have been persistent." "Like Dad," Emily observed. "Yes," Robert agreed. "Though for different reasons, perhaps. Your dad was raised in that environment, taught from childhood that family harmony meant going along with your grandparents' view of things. I had more distance, more perspective, less excuse for my silence." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We've all been silent when we should have spoken up." "Except Emily," I pointed out with a smile. "She spoke up when it mattered most." Emily beamed at this acknowledgement, then returned to questioning Robert about his travels, the conversation moving to lighter topics as Christmas morning continued. We shared a casual brunch, followed by an impromptu snowball fight in the backyard. Robert, despite his 60-plus years, proved surprisingly agile, constructing an impressive snow fort with Emily while Richard and I were pelted with well-aimed snowballs. Later, as Emily played with her new gifts and Richard prepared our Christmas dinner, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the living room. He studied the family photos on our mantel, much as Richard had done weeks earlier. "You've built a beautiful family, Sarah," he said quietly. "The real kind, not the perfect for appearances. "Thank you," I replied, touched by the observation. "It hasn't always been easy." He nodded, understanding the understatement. "Barbara called me, last week. Tried to recruit me to her cause. This didn't surprise me, given Barbara's campaign of family outreach." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd seen enough over the years to know whose version of events was more accurate." He smiled faintly. "She didn't appreciate that." "I imagine not." Robert turned from the photos to face me directly. "I want you to know something. Dad, James, considered you the daughter he should have had. He told me that more than once. He saw in you qualities that Barbara has never possessed: genuine kindness, humility, the ability to love without conditions." Unexpected tears sprang to my eyes. James had always been warm to me, but I'd never known the depth of his regard. He kept those letters because he believed someday the truth would need to be told, Robert continued. He couldn't bring himself to be the one to tell it, but he made sure the evidence would be there when someone braver did. "Emily," I said softly. "Emily," Robert agreed. "Who inherited her mother's perception and her great-grandfather's sense of justice?" Our conversation was interrupted by Richard calling us to dinner. The meal was simpler than previous Christmas feasts under Barbara's supervision. A roast chicken rather than her elaborate standing rib roast, vegetables from our local farmers, market instead of imported delicacies. But the atmosphere was relaxed and joyful in a way I couldn't remember experiencing during holidays with the elder Mitchells. Robert raised his glass in a toast. "To new traditions and honest gatherings." "And to Great-Grandpa James," Emily added solemnly. "To James," we all echoed. After dinner, as darkness fell and the Christmas lights twinkled against the snow outside, Robert handed Richard an envelope. "Before I forget, I brought something else for you. Not exactly a Christmas gift, but something I thought you should have." Richard opened it curiously, pulling out what appeared to be legal documents. As he scanned them, his expression shifted from confusion to surprise. "This is about the lake house," he said, looking up at Robert. "Dad's lake house." Robert nodded. "Technically, it's Dad's lake house, James. the property was always in. His name alone, not Tom's. When he died, his will left it to be shared equally between Tom and me. I've been letting Tom and Barbara use it exclusively because I live overseas most of the time. I didn't realize, Richard admitted. I always thought it was Dad's. That's what Barbara and Tom prefer people to think, Robert said dryly. But the point is, as half-owner, I'm entitled to use it whenever I want, and to invite whoever I want. He gestured to the documents. I've outlined my plans to spend next summer there, from June through August, and I'd like your family to join me for as much of that time as you're able. The implication was clear. The lake house, where Emily had found James's letters, where we'd spent limited, always supervised time over the years, was as much Robert's as it was Tom's, and he was explicitly inviting us to share it with him, regardless of Barbara and Tom's feelings on the matter. That's incredibly generous, I began. It's not generosity, Robert corrected gently. It's justice. That house holds as many memories for your family as it does for Tom and Barbara. Emily learned to swim in that lake. Richard spent his childhood summers there. You shouldn't be excluded because you finally stood up to Tom and Barbara's behavior. Richard studied the documents again. Dad won't be happy about this. No, Robert agreed. He won't. But the property agreement is quite clear. Either of us can use it any time and invite whomever we choose. It was a profound gesture, not just the invitation itself, but what it represented. Robert was publicly aligning himself with us, making it clear to Tom and Barbara that they couldn't isolate us from the extended family or family resources. Thank you, Richard said simply. This means a lot. Robert nodded. Dad would have wanted it this way. He loved seeing Emily at the lake. He told me once that watching her there reminded him of you as a boy, Richard, before expectations and appearances became so important. The evening continued with stories, Robert sharing memories of James that neither Richard nor I had heard before, Emily contributing her own recollections of her great-grandfather, Richard reminiscing about childhood summers at the lake house. It felt like pieces of family history were being reclaimed and rewoven into a truer, more complete tapestry. When Robert finally departed, promising to return for New Year's Day brunch, the house felt warmer somehow, as if his presence had filled gaps we hadn't fully acknowledged before. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Richard and I sat before the dying embers of the fire, talking quietly about the day. That was the best Christmas we've had in years, Richard observed, his arm around my shoulders. Maybe ever. I nodded against his chest. It felt authentic, like we could just be ourselves without monitoring every word and gesture. Robert fits with us, Richard said, sounding somewhat surprised by the realization. Better than my parents ever did. It's strange. He's been the family outsider for so long, but with us, he seems completely at ease. Maybe because none of us is trying to maintain appearances, I suggested. We're just being real with each other. Richard was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about calling my parents tomorrow. It is Christmas, after all. I sat up to look at him directly. Are you ready for that? It's okay if you're not. He considered the question carefully. I think so. Not to apologize or back down, but just to acknowledge the day. To leave the door open a crack for Emily's sake, if nothing else. I nodded, understanding. Despite everything, they were still his parents, still Emily's grandparents. Complete estrangement wasn't what any of us wanted. I think that's the right thing to do. The next morning, Richard made the call from his study. I deliberately gave him privacy, keeping Emily occupied with her new art supplies in the kitchen. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was thoughtful rather than distressed. How did it go? I asked when Emily went upstairs to get dressed. Better than I expected. Stilted, but civil. He poured himself a cup of coffee. Mom asked about Emily's Christmas. Dad mentioned they received Robert's letter about the lake house. Were they upset? Dad was clearly unhappy about it, but he didn't argue. I think he knows legally there's nothing he can do. Richard smiled slightly. The interesting part is that Mom asked if we might consider having dinner with them when they're in town for a medical conference in February. This surprised me. Barbara suggesting a meeting was unexpected, especially so soon. What did you say? That we'd discuss it as a family and let them know. He set his cup down. What do you think? I considered the question carefully. I think a public dinner in a neutral location might be a good first step. Less pressure than a private gathering, easier to keep the conversation light. Richard nodded. That was my thought too. And I made it clear that any future relationship depends on how they treat you and respect our boundaries. How did that go over? Mom was quiet. Dad said they understood. Richard shrugged. We'll see if that translates to actual change. The last week of December passed in a peaceful blur. We took Emily sledding, built elaborate snow sculptures in the backyard, and spent evenings playing board games by the fire. Robert joined us for New Year's Day as promised, bringing old family photo albums that revealed a side of the Mitchell family history Barbara and Tom rarely discussed. James as a young builder with dirt under his fingernails, Tom as a gangly teenager with a mischievous smile so like Richard's, Barbara before she had perfected her society matron persona. Dad kept these at the lake house, Robert explained as we pored over the images. In his study, another treasure Emily might have discovered if she'd had more time to explore. Emily studied a particularly candid shot of a young Barbara laughing at something off camera, her hair windblown, her expression unguarded. Grandma looks nice here, happy. She was once, Robert said thoughtfully, before appearances became more important than authentic joy. As January progressed, our new family dynamic settled into a comfortable rhythm. Richard spoke briefly with his parents every weekend, keeping the conversations light but maintaining the connection. Emily sent them artwork and school updates. I kept my distance but didn't discourage these small bridges being built. February arrived with the planned dinner looming on the horizon. As the date approached, I found myself growing increasingly anxious. Would Barbara revert to her old patterns of subtle undermining? Would Tom dismiss the issues we'd raised as emotional overreactions? Would Richard maintain his newfound backbone if tensions rose? The evening of the dinner, as I dressed in our bedroom, Richard came up behind me, meeting my eyes in the mirror. "We can cancel if you're uncomfortable," he said softly. "No one would blame you." I shook my head. "No, this needs to happen eventually. Better to take this step while we have momentum." We'd decided that Emily would stay home with a sitter, a decision she protested until Richard explained that the adults needed to establish new boundaries before bringing her into the equation. "Like when you're taming a wild animal," he'd told her with a wink. "You have to make sure it's safe before you bring in the kids." The restaurant Richard had chosen was upscale but not pretentious, a farm-to-table establishment with a relaxed atmosphere that Barbara and Tom would find acceptable without being in their preferred ultra-formal environment. We arrived 15 minutes early, giving ourselves time to settle and center before the potential stress of the reunion. When Barbara and Tom walked in, I was struck by how much they'd aged in just 2 months. Tom's shoulders seemed more stooped. Barbara's careful makeup couldn't quite conceal the new lines around her eyes. They spotted us and approached, their expressions carefully neutral. "Richard, Sarah." Tom nodded to each of us as they reached our table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Richard stood to greet them, giving his mother a brief hug and shaking his father's hand. I remained seated but offered a polite smile. "You both look well," Barbara said as they took their seats. It wasn't the effusive greeting she would have offered Richard in the past, but the lack of pointed exclusion was notable. "How was your flight?" Richard asked, easing into safe conversational territory. "Uneventful," Tom replied. The medical conference sessions have been productive. New research on pediatric immunology that might interest you, Richard. The conversation continued in this vein through the appetizers. Polite, surface level, carefully avoiding any reference to the events of Thanksgiving or their aftermath. It was the Mitchell family specialty, maintaining appearances, preserving the illusion of harmony regardless of underlying tensions. But as our main courses arrived, Barbara set down her fork and looked directly at me. Sarah, I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thanksgiving. The table went quiet. Richard tensed beside me, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. I'm not very good at this, Barbara continued, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, acknowledging my mistakes. But reading Dad's letters— You read the letters? Richard interrupted, surprised. Barbara nodded. Robert insisted we should. He brought copies to us at Christmas. She glanced at Tom, who was studying his plate with unusual intensity. It was difficult, seeing ourselves through Dad's eyes, seeing how he viewed our treatment of Sarah over the years. I remained silent, waiting to see where this was going. Barbara Mitchell had never, in 12 years, admitted fault about anything substantive. I can't say I agree with everything Dad wrote, she continued, her innate defensiveness surfacing briefly. I think he misinterpreted some of our concerns as prejudice. But she paused, visibly struggling. But I can see now that we've made you feel unwelcome in our family, Sarah. That wasn't right. It wasn't exactly an apology. Barbara hadn't actually said she was sorry or acknowledged specific behaviors, but for a woman who had spent a lifetime maintaining a facade of perfection, even this oblique admission was significant. Thank you for saying that, I replied carefully. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge how I've felt. Tom cleared his throat. We've also realized that our approach has risked our relationship with Emily. She's important. To us. Very important. The unspoken implication was clear. They recognized that continued estrangement from Richard and me would mean limited access to their granddaughter, a consequence they weren't willing to accept. Emily misses you, Richard said, offering them a small olive branch. She asks about you often. Barbara's expression softened visibly. How is she, really? As Richard shared updates about Emily's school projects and activities, I watched Barbara and Tom carefully. Their interest seemed genuine, their questions specific and thoughtful rather than perfunctory. They were making an effort, however, imperfect. When dessert arrived, Tom addressed the elephant in the room directly. Richard, Sarah, we understand that things can't go back to how they were before, but we'd like to find a way forward. A new dynamic that works for everyone. Richard looked at me, silently checking my comfort level before responding. I gave a slight nod. We want that too, Richard said. But it has to be based on mutual respect. Not just polite appearances, but genuine acceptance. And it will take time, I added. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Barbara nodded, accepting this. We'd like to see Emily soon, perhaps when we're back in town next month? A day visit might be a good start, I suggested. She'd love to show you her science. Fair project. As the evening drew to a close, no dramatic reconciliation had occurred. Barbara hadn't suddenly transformed into a warm, accepting mother-in-law. Tom hadn't abandoned his rigid ideas about status and success. But a door had been opened. A possibility created for a healthier, more honest relationship moving forward. When we said goodbye outside the restaurant, Barbara hesitated, then gave me a brief, awkward hug. Thank you for coming tonight, she said quietly. I know it couldn't have been easy. In the car heading home, Richard let out a long breath. Well, that was better than I expected. I nodded, processing the evening. Your mother actually acknowledged her behavior. Not fully, but it's a start. Do you think they can really change? Richard asked, glancing over at me. At their age? After so many years of the same patterns? I don't know, I answered honestly. I think they can modify their behavior, especially if maintaining a relationship with Emily is the motivation. True, deep change? That's harder to predict. So where does that leave us? I considered the question. Taking small steps, establishing clear boundaries, being willing to try without expecting perfection. Richard reached for my hand across the console. Thank you for being open to this. After everything they've put you through, no one would blame you if you'd chosen to cut ties completely. They're still your parents, I said simply. And Emily's grandparents. Family is complicated, but it's still family. When we arrived home, Emily was waiting up, despite the sitter's best efforts to enforce bedtime. She bombarded us with questions the moment we walked through the door. How were Grandma and Grandpa? Did they ask about me? Were they mad? Did Grandma say mean things? Is everything fixed now? Richard knelt to her level. It was a good start. Emmy, they asked about you a lot and want to see you when they're back in town next month. Not everything is fixed. That will take more time. But we're all trying. That's what matters. She absorbed this with serious consideration. Did you tell them about Uncle Robert taking us to the lake house this summer? We did, I confirmed. They already knew from Uncle Robert directly. And they're okay with it? Richard smiled slightly. They're getting used to the idea, just like they're getting used to a lot of new ideas lately. Emily nodded, satisfied with this response. Great-Grandpa James would be happy, I think. He wrote in one of his letters that he hoped someday everyone would see the truth and be kind to each other again. Out of the mouths of babes. As I tucked Emily into bed that night, she asked one final question. Mom? If Grandma and Grandpa start being nice to you, does that mean the letters worked? Like, they were what Great-Grandpa James wanted? I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, considering how to answer. I think the letters were your great-grandfather's way of bearing witness to the truth, even if he couldn't speak it aloud during his lifetime. The fact that you found them, that you were brave enough to share them when it mattered most, I think that would make him very proud. She smiled sleepily. I'm glad I found them. I just wanted everyone to see what I saw. That you're the best mom, and nobody should make you feel bad. I kissed her forehead, my heart full. Thank you, sweetheart. Get some sleep now. As I turned out her light and headed back downstairs, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. Barbara and Tom might never fully change their core, beliefs about status and background. Richard might always carry some guilt about his years of silence. But we had broken a pattern that could have continued into the next generation. Emily would grow up knowing that speaking truth matters, even when it's difficult. That family love shouldn't come with conditions. That her voice deserves to be heard. And that, I realized, was the true gift of James's letters and Emily's courage. Not a perfect resolution to family tensions, but a profound shift in what would be possible moving forward. A chance for something more authentic, more honest, more genuinely loving to take root. In the living room, the cigar box of letters sat on our mantel, a permanent reminder of a grandfather's love, a child's bravery, and the power of truth finally spoken aloud. Whatever came next with Barbara and Tom, genuine growth or merely improved behavior, those letters had already accomplished their most important purpose. They had set us free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.